feel free to be brave and sit at the front. Lawrence is quite gentle, really.
Yeah.
And if you would like a quick drink, please feel free.
We just
Oh.
need to go because we didn't know. Thank you.
A very good morning, everybody, and welcome to our morning on Piers Plowman and medieval spirituality. Thank you so much for coming along, and thank you so much for those who are joining us at home, and thank you so much for Professor Lawrence Warner, who has come all the way from London to be with us today. Thank you. And a distinguished career, 15 years at King's College London, before that in Australia, before that in the States. And dare I say, I think that Professor Warner knows about as much about Elvis as I do. And so we are in very good company this morning. If I could just share this, because I don't know if you will share this, or would you just like to say what you were doing yesterday? Was it yesterday?
Yesterday I was in the Buckley and looking at C.S. Lewis's annotated copy of J.R.R. Tolkien's edition of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight.
We think that's quite cool. Thank you. Thank you so much for giving up your time to be with us today. Without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Lawrence.
Thank you. And I don't know if Anthony will excommunicate me for this, but Roy Orbison makes an appearance in this talk, but not Elvis. We'll see.
I promise this will be the last time I charge back to the lectern. Did you know that Elvis said he would never sing a Roy Orbison song?
I did not. There's no way you could beat him.
That's what Elvis said.
Yeah.
Elvis said nobody could sing a song better than Roy Orbison, so he wasn't going to try. Let's head back a few centuries now.
Thank you very much, Anthony. Thank you for coming today. It's my real honor to be here. There are plenty of Piers Plowman people around Oxford as well, but we exist in London too, and it's great to have an opportunity to come here. I've been to Oxford many, many times. My wife is Australian, and she spent her, but I think she was 2 months old, on the plane from Newcastle, New South Wales, to Oxford, where her father had just taken up his position. He wasn't even in Australia when she was born. She spent 5 years around the corner from where I stayed last night, and then came back as a teenager, and so today I sent her pictures from up on the tower so she could have proof of her old neighborhood. So it's her second home for sure, and it's becoming mine as well. I'm very happy to be here. In 1939 appeared a short exposition of the spirituality of Piers Plowman by Father Conrad Pepler, who found in this 14th century poem a truly English and liturgical type of spirituality that must have been characteristic of the devout members of the church, both ecclesiastical and lay. Father Pepler saw the poem as delineating the beginning and growth of the spiritual life in the common man. He defined the spirituality of Piers as an objective one reflecting the restrained, austere, and majestic treatment of the liturgy, in contrast to the more subjective spirituality of the realistic and emotional devotion to the humanity of Christ, so typical of 14th century piety. Let's get to another slide. I'll put that up for now. I'm not quite there, but so we have the contrast between a more austere and, in his mind, English approach to spirituality versus tears and weeping at the foot of the cross, basically, with the effective pious tradition. The poem's central idea, wrote Father Pepler, was relationship. That from the very fact of the Incarnation, all mankind has become related to God in common brotherhood, even those outside the church. I actually brought that in. That's what I wrote at the bottom just this morning, because it occurred to me. I've prepared lots of material, which I hope you'll find interesting, and given that this is a series on spirituality, there are a lot of ways in which people might say, where's the spirituality? And this helps define that. I will say it makes sense that in 1939, Father Pepler said this. There were things going on in the world that led thinkers about medieval literature and many other things to play up Englishness as a phenomenon, as something essential that can be identified. It's not particularly accurate. And this was also a few years after, about 5 years after the discovery, but right around 1 year after the, I think, initial publication of the translation of the Book of Marjorie Kemp. Are there fans of the Book of Marjorie Kemp here? I see 2 or 3 hands. You should run, not walk, to go get a copy of the Book of Marjorie Kemp, which she is just as English as, she traveled all over the place. She went to Rome, she went to Jerusalem, she's on boats, she's walking all around England as well, and she is very much in that more European tradition. But even to say that is to say, no, but she's English. That European tradition did exist. In my third lecture this morning, I'll return to this fact that Langland, which is the name of the author. I'm going against what the slide here says. It occurs to me that I'm right in the way. Am I right in the way of the slides, or do you all see kind of...
You're right in the middle.
I'm right in the middle. But wherever I move, I'll probably be in someone's way. Is that...
Possibly.
Like, if I do that, then am I now in your way? Right. Well, I'll just try to move around a lot. So this slide says Piers Plowman, the work of 1 or 5. I'll get to that in the next couple of minutes. But basically, when I say Langland, I mean the author of the multiple versions of what we call Piers Plowman. So, yes, this is. I think that there are many English things about Piers Plowman. How could there not be? Langland was English. But other English people were doing much different things. I just want to be clear. So I think that Father Pepler was just put his finger on the pulse of Piers Plowman and had good reasons for saying it's a typically English characteristic. But I'm not pressing that line myself at all. Since it started taking shape some 650 years ago, the alliterative dream poem Piers Plowman has been a touchstone of the English literary tradition. Its textual, literary, and religious difficulties have attracted the attention of audiences from the days of Geoffrey Chaucer and the rising of 1381 up to our own. So who wrote it? For a poem so immersed in its historical context, the relative anonymity of its author is remarkable and has long been as interesting to readers as is the poem itself. That anonymity has prompted some almost conspiracy theories about how there are such dramatic political statements, radical statements that the author needed to hide his identity. That might be true. I don't see myself any particular need for that, but that's not impossible. We do not have straightforward attribution of Piers Plowman to any particular author, or perhaps I should say authors of poems, because there are over 50 surviving manuscripts. The first printed edition wasn't until 1550 by Robert Crowley, who was, among other things, he was rector of St. Giles Cripplegate, which is just down about an 8-minute walk from my flat. So I always, when that's where Milton is buried, I always kind of tip my hat to him as we walk by, but that wasn't until 1550. In the meantime, Chaucer had been printed since Caxton. The very first thing Caxton printed was Chaucer. These 50-plus manuscripts fall roughly into what seem to be 3 authorial versions of the poem, which ever since Walter Skeat in the 19th century, we have called the A, B, and C versions, not particularly imaginatively, but that it works. And then the question arises, were all 3 of these by the same poet? The question is inextricably bound up in questions of revision, addition, subtraction. Would this change be something that the same author would do, or is this more characteristic of what a reader who's heavily invested would do? This essay from 1909, Piers Plowman, the work of 1 or 5. This was written in a learned journal by J.J. Jusserand, who discussed the poem's merits with the U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt. Piers Plowman has often got the interest of quite prominent people like that. So debates were raging over the first half of last century. They were pretty much put to bed only in about 1965, but still there are people who do think that there are different versions. So most people think, different authors, most people think that the different versions are the result of a poet who was obsessive and who kept on working on this, and that what we have is almost accidental. It happened to be copied at a certain moment and then distributed. As for earlier years, the editor of the, Sir Robert Crowley, the 1550 editor, wrote that he said, "I have learned that the author was named Robert Langland, a Shropshire man born in Cleobury, about 8 miles from Malvern Hills." The opening of the poem takes place with a dreamer falling asleep on the Malvern Hills, and there are a few other references. This forename, Robert, seems to be the result of a misreading of one line as recorded now in only one of those 50-plus manuscripts. "And I, Robert, in russet began to roam about." That I, Robert, actually is where other manuscripts say that I was e-robed, as in summer is e-coming in. It's the participle. I was robed. So there's no Robert. The Malvern connection gave rise to a competitor first proposed by John Stowe in 1580, that the poem was written around 1342 by John Malvern, which that comes up again, a fellow of Oriel College, here at Oxford. Not everyone was convinced by these proposals. In 1792, Joseph Ritson, the antiquarian and atheist and Republican and vegetarian and a fascinating figure, he wrote, "The writer is still anonymous. There is no reason to believe that it was either Robert Langland or John Malvern, but on the contrary, a substantial one that it was not," which he doesn't tell us. He left it there. How then did the name William Langland, by which the poet is most commonly called today, how did that name come to attach to him? The first name, William, arises in part because the poem is structured as a series of dream visions, between which are waking episodes that depict the dreamer, named Will, with a plausible biography. He was a clerk in minor orders. He had a wife and child, Kit and Colette. He moved from Malvern to London. He lived in Cornhill in the city. All this seems nicely to accord with the circumstances of the poem's production, particularly that its dialect is that of the Malvern area of the Southwest Midlands. As for the surname Langland, a single line in one of the versions reads nicely as a reverse acrostic. "I have lived in Londe, quod I. Me naam is Long Will." So Will, Long, Lond. Will Langland, it seems to be. And in many manuscripts, in the margins there is the Latin gloss, nomen auctores, the name of the author. There's also external evidence that William Langland was the name of the author. So I have the top part of the slide is what I've just read. And the bottom is from a manuscript dated to 1427, which says that one Stacy de Rockele was Pater Wilhelmi de Langland, who, this Wilhelmus, this William, fecit librum qui vocatur Piers Plowman. He made the book which is called Piers Plowman. One scholar has recently pursued the logic of this inscription to its limit. We learned that in 1356, one William de la Rockele, parson of Esthorpe, yielded to his kinsman John his claim to over 300 acres of land, including some 7 houses. This author, this scholar Robert Adams writes, "Obviously, this transaction does not attest to the sort of heart-wrenching poverty that some readers have wanted to associate with the life of Long Will." Well, quite so. The difficulty for this approach is that the poem does have heart-wrenching poverty that is associated with clearly the author figure. And I've already mentioned conspiracy theories. It seems like one of the big attractions of that is precisely that it's so crazy. So I'm not a believer in that one, but it's important to get all this out there. And you can go and check on that book. there are major questions that arise from this inscription. Another historian has recently discovered a record that casts that question in another light. One Wilhelmus Vocatus Long Will, William, who was called Long Will, was among the dozen men who in 1385 stood accused of aiding and abetting the murder by the half-brother of King Richard II of Sir Ralph Stafford, son and heir of the Earl of Stafford. Is this our man too, or instead? Could he have been part of the king's expedition to Scotland, ready to go into battle for his king? All sorts of questions arise. It's a fascinating topic. What it has to do with the spirituality of Piers Plowman is a good question, and I would say, as far as we can tell, not much, but it's inherently interesting and it's worth trying to know what we can. So I thought I would begin with an overview. For whatever his identity, this poet devoted some 3 decades, again assuming that there's the one poet, some 3 decades to the production and revision of Piers Plowman. We're saying roughly 1360 to 1390. Let me give a brief overview now of what the poem is, its contents and its structure, with the codicil, of course, that I'm conflating these 3 different versions into a basic idea, because they all are called Piers Plowman for good reasons. Each of the 3 versions consists of a prologue in which the protagonist, because it's first person, Will, falls asleep on the Malvern Hills and dreams of a fair field full of folk, of all estates and moralities. And that's often been a phrase that lots of people have picked up on. Modern readers, John Cruikshank, the Nobel laureate, that's the one bit of Piers Plowman that shows up in his corpus. Maureen Duffy, London author, is inspired by this in many of her writings where people would have had no idea. It shows up all over the place, and it becomes a notion of a communal notion that fits in well with what I'll be talking about today. So we open, he dreams of this fair field full of folk, which he can kind of see from where he's fallen asleep from the Malvern Hills, of all estates, followed by, after the prologue, what are called passus, P-A-S-S-U-S, and that is the Latin for the word step, and it means chapters, basically. The A version stops after 11 of these. It seems like Langland just kind of couldn't figure out what to do next. But the B version keeps going for up to 20 passus, and then the C version revises those into 22, so passages are moved around and things like that. It seems that Langland, having composed about 2,500 lines of the A version, abandoned that, like I say, reworking its material and so forth, along the lines I've just outlined. This has long been, so the B version has long been, which people date to around 1379, early in Richard II's reign, has long been the most widely taught and discussed version, but C is really the last statement we have from the poem, from the poet, and so every once in a while I'll quote from that during the course of the morning. Let's talk about the poetry itself. The 3 versions of the poem together constitute by far the most popular specimen of its form of alliterative long lines. Also, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which I spent yesterday looking at, exemplifies this. This form relies not upon rhyme, but upon, rather, the interplay between stressed and unstressed syllables, which is not alternating, as in Chaucer, and the interplay between those stressed syllables and alliterative staves, alliterative stressed syllables. Sometimes the stressed syllables don't alliterate in these lines. Usually the fourth, the last one of the line does not. We have, where should I men find such a friend with so fray an herte? That top line. So find, friend, free, heart. That's just a good example. With the caesura marked in the middle. The caesura is a very important part of it. In this manuscript, it's marked in the middle. So there's a lot of discussion about how this really works, but you get the basic idea, I hope, that we have 2 half lines. The first half, in general, has 2 stressed syllables. Sometimes it has 3, or sometimes it has 3 stresses, one of which isn't alliterative. And the second half has 2 of which the last sometimes alliterates, but usually does not. And usually the second half line has one, but can only have one sequence of 2 to 3 unstressed syllables, which is called a long dip. So, with so fre and herte, with so, that's the long dip of that line. Or, mi nam is long will. So, mi nam is would be the unstressed syllables there. The alliterative long line would have appealed to Langland in large part because the imbalance between the first and second half lines, the A verse and the B verse, prevents any sense of easy stability and prompts the reader forward, rendering it a particularly apt mode for satirical poetry. I'll mention that mode, particularly as it pertains to sermons, a fair bit this morning. Usually the alliteration signals the line's emphasis, but this scheme is flexible enough to enable other modes of meaning to establish themselves as well. Here's a nice line. That on doth, all doth, and H doth be his honor. The alliteration there is actually on vowels, which any vowel can alliterate with any other or with a word that begins with an H. But we have that one does, all do, and each does on his own. All 4 of the alliterative staves there are the vowels, but we have the 3 does, which usually would alliterate. So we kind of have competing alliterations. It's a very flexible form in that sense. Piers Plowman's employment of this form also makes it one of a group of poems that treat of major theological issues in a manner accessible to the laity and to readers of the vernacular. Some critics have thus placed it within a movement expounding a vernacular theology. Really, when people say that phrase, who pops right into one's mind is Julian of Norwich. And I'll return to vernacular theology, particularly in the third talk this morning. But it equally draws upon Latin registers and traditions. For among the most startling characteristics of the poem, especially in the longer B and C versions, is its insistent use of Latin tags and lines, usually set off in the manuscripts by being boxed or written in red. In this slide, they're the italicized lines. At certain moments, the effect of these lines, if I have another one. No, I'll keep it here. The effect of these lines is to settle things down or to provide the sense of closure achieved in Chaucer by the iambic couplets. The peaceful end of the debate of the 4 daughters of God, after which Will awakens and urges his wife and daughter, Kit and Colette, to reverence the cross at church on Easter morning, for instance, cites the Psalms as well as a liturgical hymn, and that's the first longer one. Du seist so ritwisnesse and reverently kiste, pace and pace here per saeculus seculorum, misericordia et veritas obviaverunt sibi, justitia et pax osculate sunt. Truth trumpetilo, and song te deum laudamus, and dan lute love in a rude note, ecce quam bonum et quam jocundum, etc. In this passage, as in many others, you can get the idea basically that truth is trumpeting and they're singing all the liturgical kinds of lyrics that we began with today. The scriptural quotations are here foundational. They're not just ornamental. Righteous is psalmic verse. They're the misericordia, mercy and truth have met each other. Justice and peace have kissed. And that lists what turn into the allegory of the 4 daughters of God who have debates over the purpose of creation and such things. That verse has generated the drama in which these abstractions embrace each other. Yet Latin does not just authorize the poet's theology. In the prologue occurs an exchange among a, quote, a lunatic, the angel of heaven, who loed to spake in Latin, and commoners. These are 3 separate categories. The angel of heaven is not the lunatic. So we have the lunatic, the angel, and the commoners, who began to cry in verse of Latin, to cry out in verses of Latin, an especially charged example of the variety of poetic modes manifested in Langland's verse forms. Latin's prominence in Piers Plowman is also a clue both to Langland's processes of composition and to his poem's creation of meaning. Langland offers his readers some practical advice in how to read this intermixture of Latin and English. The context is this other, the last passage on here, is the rebuke by the allegorical figure Conscience of the reading practices of Lady Mead, that's M-E-E-D, that is reward, or it's even been translated money. I leve well, laddie, quoth Conscience, that the Latin be true. Ac thou art like a laddie that read a lesson on us, was omnia probate, and that pleased her herte, for that lean was no longer at the leve's end. Had she looked at that left half, and the left turned, she should have found in fellow words following thereafter. Quod bonum est tenete. Truth that text mad. The lady in question had been attracted by the text, test all things, but missed the rest of the sentence. Hold that which is good. This is 1 Thessalonians. Piers Plowman is full of quotations that in effect occur at the leaf's end, as does the scriptural text this lady reads. Over and over these Latin tags end with etc., and that indicates we need to go read the rest, the etc., to find out what the meaning really is. The vision is of Langland poring over commentaries, biblical commentaries, structuring his poem as preachers did their sermons. A great scholar named John Alford really promoted this, and I think he's right on target. With the authorities from Scripture and the commentary tradition providing the substance of the poem, a verbal concordance he adopted to his poetry, from which he both worked out and towards which he also moved. The fundamental interpretive issue concerns the status of the dreamer's journey or education, and the extent to which readers' response to any given episode should be governed by what came before or is to come later. Since it's not the standard novel, it's not like you get to the end to find out what you're supposed to have thought the whole time. The rug can be pulled from you at any given moment. The manuscripts have rubrics according to which the opening visions, my apologies, make up the vision, visio, and the rest of the poem are categorized as the three vitae, the three lives. The lives of do well, do better, and do, over to you. Best, do best. Yes, those are the three lives. Are these rubrics authorial or are they scribal? If they're authorial, then Langland wished his readers to think about his poetry on a large scale. If they're scribal, if an early reader was responsible, then at least that person did so regardless, did think of the poem that way, and led many of the poem's subsequent readers to do likewise. A 16th century scribe comes up with an additional scheme, dividing the text of his B copy, or her B copy, who knows, their B copy, into 35 chapters, indicated by capitals, that are carefully aligned with moments of structural significance. This copy retains the standard passus as well. A much earlier scribe of B uniquely divides the poem into 16 rather than 21 sections, though it's unclear whether this signals confusion or insight. A related question, perhaps especially for a Center for Spirituality, is whether the poem does depict spiritual or intellectual progress or progression along the lines of, say, the Divine Comedy. It's clear enough that Piers Plowman moves from the more social concerns of the vision, such as the proper functioning of the king, or each person's responsibilities to the community according to their station in life, to more individual and personal concerns in the life of Dubet in particular. So there is a movement, at the least. That he spends so much of the poem seeking the three do's would seem to suggest that he is on a pilgrimage of sorts, which will issue in some sort of enlightenment. And yet, first of all, that just doesn't happen. Second, different figures give him different answers. During one waking episode, a friar says that Do Well dwells among the friars. A few lines later, when Will is again asleep, the figure thought defines the three do's as being true in speech and work, patient preaching, and serving as bishop, respectively. In the next passage, the figure wit identifies Do Well with marriage, going on to expound the ethics of sexuality and so forth. None of these definitions is wholly authoritative, obviously. And Wit himself, the one who talks about marriage, is then upbraided by his wife Dame Study in the next passage for his intellectual presumption. I mentioned the rug being pulled. Well, there it's very explicitly pulled. So we think that we're on some road, or Will does, and then finds out he's not. The insights of the middle portion, the life of Dubet, in which Will encounters thought, wit, and study, and all the rest of the allegorical abstractions. I'm just going to put this up for a change of scenery for a minute. So the insights of that portion are extraordinarily rich. They culminate in a magnificent discourse by an allegorical figure called imaginative, which I'll probably say this twice. I always need to go over a few times what they say imaginative means. It is the ability to create pictures or ideas via interaction with objects. I suppose that's more or less a good definition for what a lot of our imagination is, but it's more precise, it's more scholastic. Many pressing theological problems are rendered comprehensible for the dreamer in this section, such as the need for justice on the one hand, shouldn't only the good be saved, and grace on the other. Salvation is God's gift to everybody. And we'll return to that tension later this morning. This inner journey in which the dreamer seeks a more mystical meaning than the one he originally hopes will be explicated by Holy Church, Lady Holy Church, can make for very difficult reading. It's a bit that a lot of people skip over, but has in many ways been at the heart of modern criticism of the poem, because we literary critics love to talk about the bits everyone else skips over. They're the ones that really need a lot of explanation. No doubt our own advances in the realms of psychology have rendered this one of the richest and most palatable sections. I realize I'm contradicting myself. I've just said that this is the most difficult section, and now I'm saying it's one of the most palatable sections of Piers Plowman. I suppose the Lord works in mysterious ways, and that's true of Piers Plowman. Where our distance from the pseudo-feudal world imagined in other portions might make them seem more medieval to us today. I suppose a lot of people would prefer the more kind of medieval sections and would say, I don't want psychology today. So I suppose I can make sense of my contradiction that way. Other allegorical personifications represent concepts as disparate as financial recompense. I've just mentioned that. Mead. The seven deadly sins are all personified. Theological concepts like Holy Church, and elements of the soul such as wit. I've already mentioned all of this, in fact. Such figures interact with non-allegorical personages, as when the king proposes a marriage between Mead and Conscience. In one breathtaking sequence, Langland has the allegorical personification anima, that is soul, and confusingly anima is male, although the Latin word is female. That's been very interesting to lots of modern readers. So, anima recounts the concept of charity not via a personification, but rather as the history of England's conversion to Christianity, beginning with Augustine. And this then is followed by a metaphor of the tree of charity, a very confusing metaphor. And then we get a passage full of biblical typology in which Abraham is called faith, Moses is called hope, and so forth. We've got the Good Samaritan showing up and doing all sorts of things with faith and hope and leading to Christ showing up. I mean, it's a real whirlwind. Finally comes an account of Christ's incarnation, itself allegorized as a romance, which is going to be a topic of the third section this morning, so I'm not going to give that away too much. But it is a romance. God loves us. That's the idea. Piers Plowman might not have the sorts of memorable individual characters that feature in the Canterbury Tales, but it is unmatched in its combination of genres, allegorical modes, and not least portrayal of and meditation on the lives of laborers in medieval England. And a lot of historians, particularly early, about 100 years ago, were using Piers Plowman as a source text, really. That's what Robert Adams was kind of scorning when he said, oh, well, the author was rich and owned 7 houses and 300 acres of land, or 300 acres of land. Silly historians and readers for taking seriously this portrayal of poverty. A major episode has Piers the Plowman, who himself, I haven't even mentioned, there's a character called Piers the Plowman. Peter, it's just the name Peter. He enjoins pilgrims who are trying to find a guide to go on pilgrimage. He enjoins them to plow a half acre before they head out. Of course, the trick is that the plowing of the half acre in this allegorical approach is the pilgrimage itself. Its power inheres as much in its dramatization of labor strife in the wake of the plague of 1348 as in its role of the allegory of repentance or penance. In the confession episode, which is part of this whole sequence as well, the account, which came a little bit before, the idea is they've been confessed and now they have to go on a pilgrimage to achieve satisfaction. The account of gluttony in the tavern is so colorful and lively that it almost undermines the sense that we should avoid the drink. It's kind of like Satan in Paradise Lost. That's where all the fun is. But we're not supposed to like Satan. What's going? And Jesus is the most boring character in that. That's a big problem, isn't it? So everyone loved the gluttony scene. It's the most widely read scene. All the manuscripts are very heavily thumbed there. The most memorable of all, perhaps for us today, are the long additions to a section in the C version in which the dreamer, awaking, although he's awake, he's interrogated by reason and conscience, and he defends his life as a poet unsuited for manual labor. They're trying to say, why aren't you working? You tall man who's just walking around. He says, he says, I'm a poet. What do you want from me? I can't do that stuff. Another passage added to the C version is an anguished attempt to distinguish the worthy from the unworthy poor. These passages encapsulate the impossibilities of reconciling the vision of a perfect Christian society with the reality of that society's fallen state. Of all the tensions embodied in the poem's alliterative line, structure, and variety of its allegorical modes, that between the ideal and the actual, made manifest in the problem of the poor, perhaps strikes modern readers most forcefully. And again, to lay my cards on the table, that's just why, whatever the historical legitimacy of this claim that the poet had a sinecure and was really, I just don't buy it because of the poem itself. Let's step back a bit now and take a broader look at the historical context that generated Piers Plowman and even vernacular literature at large. How am I doing for time? Around when should this one end?
Roughly
around now?
Roughly about 11:30. So we have a bit of time.
That's fine. I actually don't have that many more pages for this section. That was good. Okay. And I'm already on the right slide for where I'm going now. Langland refers on a number of occasions to a major event, which I just mentioned, the 1348 plague, which decimated the population, and which kept on flaring up through 1361 or so, and we probably imagine that Langland starts writing around 1360. So, let's assume he was around 20 or so. Anthony, how old was Elvis when he got started? 17, 18?
That's around almost 19.
19, we'll take that as when Langland started to the Elvis of his day. So if we work backwards, then around 1340, so he would have experienced these outbursts of plague firsthand, for sure. In his eyes, these episodes brought about an ethical downfall, or at least the economic conditions conducive to such a downfall. In the prologue's account of the Fairfield of Folk, we hear of parish priests who complain to their bishop that their parish was poor since the pestilence time. That's the second line there. Parsons in parish Christus. It's a hard hand to read, we've got the line through that descender and the curl above that P, both stand for any combination of R and a vowel in whatever form you need. So we have parsons and parish, and those are long, two long S's followed by an H to make it look very complicated. Parsons and parish priests complained, they plained him, that's just the reflexive, they complained themselves, to Herr Bishop, to their bishop, that her parish was poor, sith the pestilence tema. Since the time of the pestilence, their parish was poor, prompting them to request permission to bolt, to get away from their parish, and to go to London, where they can get someone to pay for them to pray for their grandfather, basically. A later passage cites the pestilence as causing the collapse of marriage. This is in that section by, I think it was Witt, I said. Back to a nicer hand. This is a hand by a scribe who's quite famous, whose name has shown up in The Guardian and the New York Times, called Adam Pinkhurst. For a good 10 years, he was known as Chaucer's personal scribe. He was not. But he did write this lovely manuscript of Piers Plowman in a much easier to read hand. Many per sidden the pestilence han plicht hem to gitters the fruit that bring forth arn foole wordes. Aren, that should be here's where we know this should be disyllabic. Aren, A-R-N should be A-R-E-N. Foole wordes, the fruit that brings forth since people have started misbehaving in the pestilence, are foul words, and jealousy joyless, and jangling in bed. So sexual misconduct is one of the fruits of all this. On the one hand, the Black Death is simply the cause of the economic difficulties that bring about temptation for the priests and a lack of appropriate mates. On the other, the behaviors described seem to be figured in or themselves infected by the pestilence. So it's unclear whether this is the effect or the manifestation, really, of that pestilence. And this is something that throughout Piers Plowman you're always wondering. It's very hard to know. I mean, we had it bad enough during COVID, and COVID had nothing on what was going on then. This is from a nice manuscript. To me, it almost looks like a 19th century reimagining, but this is a proper, around 1400, depiction in a manuscript in Trinity College, Cambridge. God speed the plow and send us corn enough. The pestilence's effects on the poem, though, go much deeper than such isolated social observations. The episode of the plowing of the half-acre, in particular, has been influentially read as Langland's attempt to come to terms with the social and economic upheaval brought about by the Black Death. The basic statistics are well known. The population was reduced by a third to a half. There was suddenly a market for laborers, and yet laborers were serfs bound to their lords. That's why the statute of laborers comes in 1349, and there are different iterations of it. Another major one was 1388, which tried to force laborers not to sell their wares, so sell their labor. So these ordinances and statutes, 1349, 1351, 1388, responded directly and explicitly to this issue, identifying the problem as the malice of servants who were idle and not willing to serve after the pestilence without excessive wages. We can see a lot of this happening on the streets of Minnesota and things like that today. It's very much the same kind of top-down authoritarian response to really structural economic problems. Plowmen and other laborers shall take the liveries and wages accustomed in the years before the pestilence, or they will face imprisonment. That was the fantasy, at least, of these statutes. That was the law. Now, actually, there's little doubt that, at least in theory, Langland approved of this. It's kind of like today's New York Times has this, Republicans are starting to worry about the effects of ICE. Like, they're all fine with, let's get rid of illegal immigrants in the States, but this way, and I think that will be something that Langland might have, because we shouldn't imagine that somehow Langland is a big progressive late 20th, early 21st century person protesting on the streets against ICE or anything like that. But I think that he was quite conservative in a lot of ways. I think that seems to fit well where he's coming from. He's certainly, I will say this, he is genuine and authentic in working through the problems in a way that few other thinkers could match. In the celebrated scene of the plowing of the half acre, which is, as you can tell, is a real touchstone of the poem, the sinners have all confessed and been enjoined to go on a pilgrimage to Saint Truth. But no one knows the way. Suddenly Piers the Plowman materializes, offering to be their guide, but only after everyone helps him in plowing the half acre. This is what I referred to before. So this lecture in a lot of ways is recursive in a way that the poem itself is recursive, appropriately. That plowing of the half acre, of course, turns out to constitute the pilgrimage itself, and the work he enjoins the pilgrims is to do the work they must do in this life. So their plowing is that wives and widows will spin wool and flax and teach their daughters to do likewise. Knights should protect Holy Church and protect Piers from wicked men and hunt the boars that break his hedges, and so forth. So it's a very conservative vision of the three estates doing what they should properly do. They should do well. They should live well. And that is the plowing of the half acre. They're not quite clever enough to figure out that that's what's really going on, that when Piers says, oh, knights, go do this, he's actually saying this is the plowing and this is the pilgrimage. And all this, though, just utterly fails. It does not work. Piers eventually calls hunger, the allegorical personage hunger, to punish these lazy wasters. On the one hand, the problem is that we are all sinners, and no one wants to put in the hard work required to make society flourish or to achieve salvation. On the other hand, though, the problem seems to be that the workers recognize that their value in here is not in their God-given place in society, but on the open market. Thus, from this perspective, Langland himself recognizes that he cannot uphold those principles that in theory, he does support. In the B text, Truth grants a pardon, but Piers tears it up in pure anger, in puritaine, and abandons his plowing for the life of prayer. One critic writes that clearly the transformation is a religious conversion, forcing an abandonment of attempts to equate the work ethos, now so favored by employers and their clerical allies, with Christian moral theory and faith. Piers's and Langland's retreat is thoroughly intelligible, and with perhaps a few inconsistencies sustained for the rest of the poem. It's kind of a bleak response, but I think it's an accurate one, that there is a real retreat. But as I say, at least he's put it to the test in a way that Chaucer certainly did and very few others did. Piers's abandonment of the equation of the work ethos with Christian moral theory and faith famously led to his appearance in the letters of John Ball, one of the leaders of the Rising of 1381, often known as the Peasants' Revolt. John Sheep bids Piers Plowman go to his work, and chastise well Hob the robber, and take with you John Truman, and so forth. That's how this letter works. Now, but this might be a reference not to Langland's poem at all. I think it's kind of typical of Langland scholars to say, ooh, here's my poem, right in the middle of history. To me, it makes much more sense that the Piers the Plowman there is like the John Truman or Hob the Robber. That is a folk personage widely known that both Langland and John Ball happen to know about. If Ball did know Piers Plowman, the poem, I think it's much more likely that the version he knew was the A version rather than B. And people really, in my field, they really care about this kind of thing. Maybe we shouldn't, I don't know, maybe so, but I thought I would at least mention that that's going on. Whatever the case, if he did have the poem in mind, like I say, he did a pretty good job of hiding it, which might be a clue that maybe we're not supposed to be worried so much about this. The references he makes, the supposed references to the poem, are quite anodyne and general. The same also goes, I'll say, with when people say that Chaucer clearly knew Piers Plowman. The evidence they use is that he has a figure of a plowman, and oh my goodness, there are parallels between the language. They both dig and delve, and it alliterates too. It's like, I can't believe what I'm seeing. That's the level that we're talking about. Plowman dug and delved. You did not need to read Piers Plowman to know this. So I don't think there's any evidence that Chaucer had any knowledge of the poem Piers Plowman. Although it's quite possible that they were actually neighbors in London. Maybe they did. But there's just no evidence that there is. That's all I'm saying. If Langland invented the figure of Piers Plowman, he too did a good job of making him seem like an ancient figure akin to Tom Tinker, Hob the Robber, Miles the Miller, and Pierce Potter. I'm not the first to make this observation. In fact, it was Margaret Aston, I think she was based here, who really made that point. For these reasons, I find it a better analysis to see both Langland and Ball responding to what I've been talking about the last 5 or 10 minutes, the effects of the plagues, rather than to imagine one very literate leader of a peasants' revolt sitting down reading this quite intellectual poem, as popular as it was. So that's my overview of how the 1348 events, which themselves led directly to 1381, really created the world in which Langland was working and in which he was trying to figure out. Now, I'm getting close to the end of this section with this takes us towards the next lecture. We're going to rewind the clocks for these last 2 or 3 minutes by another 165 years to the year that was, it wouldn't overstate things too much to say, the most important in the story of the poem's creation. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, exactly 810 years ago now, well over a century before Langland's birth. The Fourth Lateran Council, Lateran IV for short, had 2 effects directly relevant to Piers Plowman and his culture. The first was a concerted effort to educate the laity in the tenets of the Christian faith. Also, I should say, I say to educate the laity, that is true. More important was to educate the priesthood, who had no idea the tenets of the Christian faith was a big problem. And basically to teach them how to confess, how to serve as confessors. There were lots of handbooks and guidebooks for that. In England, Bishop Richard Poor's Salisbury statutes direct priests to instruct children or have them taught in those tenets in small groups or even one-on-one. Parents are enjoined as well to teach their children in households. The second major effect that was directly relevant was the dictate that all Christians who had attained the age of reason had to confess their sins to their own priests at least once a year. And that's what led, like I say, then they figured, we better make sure the priests are able to do this themselves. And these confessional encounters were seen as suitable occasions for the formal instruction in the tenets of the faith, which needed to be publicized. Thus, within a few decades, manuals instructing priests on conducting confession had begun to proliferate, as had, and there's the Fourth Lateran Council in that slide, as had treatises instructing lay people on preparing for and making confession. So the latter form, these treatises, these vernacular treatises, for the most part, were unsurprisingly, because they were intended for a broad audience, they emphasized narrative detail and interest. Works like Handling Sin. Here's a manuscript of Handling Sin. The book called Handling of Sin. It says at the top quite helpfully. A little bit of a later hand there. Works like Handling Sin, not to mention the sermons preached every Sunday, introduced what are called examples from the Bible, as well as stories from everyday life. Midwives, monks tempted into naughty things, witchcraft, misers, minstrels, bears, all the world, the good and the great, show up in these sermons. They were all recruited to the cause. Handling Sin and other explicitly devotional works are the most obvious result of this movement. The Middle English poem, so-called poem, I should say, extant in the largest number of manuscripts, is called the Prick of Conscience. The idea being that your conscience is pricked, and then you go through the process of confession, absolution, and satisfaction. I say it's a common thing for medievalists who want to look quite righteous to say, oh, the Prick of Conscience is in more manuscripts than anything, and you're there reading Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, you're a dilettante, that's only in one manuscript. My response to that is, I would much rather spend my life reading Sir Gawain and the Green Knight than Prick of Conscience, which no one reads. To call it a poem is just to be a bit nice. It's versified instruction, which is a perfectly good thing to have. Versified instruction in how to be a Christian. That's a different thing from a great poem. Anyway, the Prick of Conscience, the final tale of the Canterbury Tales, the Parson's Tale. It's not a tale at all. It's Chaucer's treatise on penance. These are all firmly of this mode and would not have existed. And you could go further, and some people have. A critic called John Jung pointed out that really the vernacular literature of the later Middle Ages is a direct outgrowth from these decisions at the Fourth Lateran Council. So that provides, we began with a few lines from the poem, or a 1939 overview of the poem itself, but I wanted to end by putting things in, this lecture, putting things in a big context of Lateran IV, and which points out to us that Piers Plowman is of a kind with the Canterbury Tales, John Lidgett, the Book of Margery Kempe, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, with all of it. All this literature, to some degree or other, is concerned with the sacrament of penance. That's at the core, and that's going to be the focus of my second lecture. Thanks very much.
Can I ask a naughty question,
Mhm.
please? Are all the Latin parts, are they all direct quotations from the Vulgate, or are there other liturgical Latin in there as well?
There's liturgical Latin as well.
There is both, yeah.
There's one bit that I'm the one who identified where it came from, but it was from a preacher's handbook by John Bromere. There are cases where we can tell that they're liturgical because it differs from the Vulgate. The bit that says the Good Shepherd should lead, John 6:11. Is that John? What's that? Good Shepherd. John something. John 10, I think verse 11. Verse 11? Anyway, that the Good Shepherd should lead.
I think it is.
That there's one difference in the words, and it's from the Old Latin, which is what was the liturgical reading for the day. And there are lots of other Latin bits to show up. Cato is a big, someone shows up all the time. So it's not all necessarily Christian.
What I'm going to suggest, although I'm guessing we've got lots of questions, I love that. I've learned so much, is that I was just about to quote John Ball, but I'm not. I'm going to be good, because some of us just may need to stretch ourselves a little bit, and we're running on a fairly close timetable to get through today. So if we have questions, do feel free to come and ask now over tea and coffee, and there will be a little Q&A session right at the end. But can I suggest that we get up, move around, there's Ludus out there, and we'll regroup at 20 to 12.
And I'm quite happy anytime for you to come up and